will go ahead and get started. We don't have a lot of time together today, so I want to make sure that we hear from Gary and Jessica. They have some great nuggets to share with us. So let's go ahead and jump in. All right. So welcome again. Good morning, good afternoon, GreenBiz community. I don't know about you, but I am excited to participate in Circularity 21 this year. What great sessions and what great speakers the GreenBiz team have lined up for us. My name is Renee Loper. I am Vice President of Program Innovation at Pixera Global, and I am even more excited that you have joined me and my two colleagues, Gary Cooper, CEO of Reaply, and Jessica Stago, Director of Business Incubation at Change Labs, for a very candid and frank conversation around what it means and what it takes to co-create an inclusive circular economy. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. So before we dive in, a few housekeeping items. The session will be recorded, as are all of the other sessions, and the recording will be available 2 weeks after this event. Please do use the chat and Q&A function, not only to communicate with each other, but also to ask us questions. We do want to incorporate your questions and your thoughts into our conversation. And as I ask Jessica and Gary questions, I also ask you to answer those questions amongst yourselves so we can make this a truly dynamic and inclusive conversation. And lastly, please be sure to take the survey at the end of our conversation. It should be pinned at the top of the chat box. All right, now we only have 27 minutes left, so let's get started. Let's be clear, why are we here today? We are not going to completely solve for co-creating inclusive circular systems in our 27 minutes together, but my hope is that we can merely plant seeds and spark ideas, spark questions, which I'm sure will leave you hopefully wanting to reach out to us and or reach out to others in your GreenBiz network to find answers or create answers for. But if I had to list 3 clear objectives, this is what I would leave for you. I hope that you will walk away having considered why it is essential that the most historically marginalized communities be at the forefront of the circular transition. 2, with thought starters on how to build trust and how to communicate openly and authentically with different cultures and groups as you are on your respective circular journeys. And 3, having learned a bit from real-time examples of how historically marginalized communities are already proactively engaging in the circular economy. One thing to note, when we speak of historically marginalized communities, we're referencing those that are most often left out of the conversation and the equation. So in the US or even in Europe, that's Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, and communities with lower socioeconomic status. And in emerging economies globally, it's waste reclaimers, it's those working in the supply chain and the like. In all of the work that we do at Pixera Global, from advising corporations who are on their circular economy journey, to building coalitions around forming inclusive circular cities, to developing skills-based talent and community building programs, one thing remains constant for us, and that is centering traditionally overlooked communities and ensuring that they are contributors to the conversations and to the development of solutions to the problems that ultimately affect them. To that end, I couldn't think of anyone better to join me today to discuss what this means in a circular economy context than Jessica and Gary. So by way of very brief introductions, in her work at Change Labs, Jessica leads the work centered around cultivating and supporting Native American entrepreneurs with the aim of empowering them and ensuring they have the tools and the resources that they need to thrive, all with a focus on propelling the community toward economic self-sustainability. And Gary, who got the idea for Reaply, which combines the words research and cheaply, love it, while pursuing his PhD in neuroscience at Northwestern University, he saw the opportunity for the university to break down silos when it came to sharing physical assets across departments. And he decided to develop a platform to enable this. And so he and the Reaply team have been helping companies make good on circular commitments through their resource sharing platform ever since. Okay, Jessica, Gary, let's turn to you. Let's dive right in. Considering that circular economy continues to be amplified as the way of our economic future, and we know that so many are not envisioned as critical to realizing that future, I have a loaded question for you. Why is it important to have this particular conversation at this particular moment with the Green Biz community? And why is this conversation important to your work at Change Labs and important to your work at Reaply? Jessica, let's begin with you.
Thank you, Renee. And I just want to say I'm so happy to be here with everybody, and I also looking forward to the conversation. And I'm sure this 30 minutes, well, less than that now, is going to go by so quick. So let's just go ahead and get right into it. So at Change Labs, what we're trying to do is really support those entrepreneurs that have the solutions to the problems that we see within our communities. And our community has really been a sacrifice zone for pretty much the growth of the western half of the United States for the last 50 years. So in order for urban centers to grow, the whole western part of the United States needed access to cheap energy and also water. And those resources came from our communities. And unfortunately, what that's left us with now that there's a transition to renewable energy is that the sites that we have no longer are accessible to our communities, either for agriculture or even just for cultural sites. And also, we're left with close to 50% unemployment now, which is even worse now that NGS, the Navajo Generating Station, has closed, which was the largest power plant in the Western United States. And also the coal mines that were associated with that coal-fired plant has also closed. So, we were promised about 40 years ago, an economy from this extractive industry. And what we've seen today is that didn't happen. The transition to renewable energy sounds great. Across the board, it sounds like a solution for climate change. But I think that what we need to remember is that that energy transition doesn't necessarily mean that those communities that were impacted from the damage of extractive industries are going to benefit from that transition, and that we have to specifically look at solutions that are going to create benefit to our communities. And we feel at Change Labs that that's what our entrepreneurs will do. The entrepreneurs that we work with see the damage that's happened. They know the history. Their families are directly affected, but they've also have the ability to see what's happening outside the world, to see those opportunities, and to be able to create solutions and from an entrepreneurial perspective. And we want to support that, but with Change Labs and also just breaking down the barriers that have existed from colonialism and a history of our history with the federal government, which makes entrepreneurship very difficult in our communities. But we have an awesome group of, an awesome ecosystem that we're building of people who really have the energy and the ideas to break down those barriers and create a sustainable economy.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. The sacrifice zone, I want to come to that, and then breaking down barriers left from colonialism. I want to come back to that too. But Gary, let's turn to you. Why is this conversation important now? And why is this conversation important to Reaply?
Now is the time we have to do something more. And I don't think that we can transition to a green, low carbon, circular economy without people who are brown and black and white and yellow and all shades of between. I think it's literally impossible, as well as I think it's practically so as well. So I think you have to involve those communities, those stakeholders in the ideation, in the implementation, as well as the end benefits. And this would be a departure from how the linear economy has come to scale. So I think when we think about these transitions to a low carbon circular economy, though it's for a green reason, it has to involve all shades of color at every table until that's fully implemented. From a Reaply perspective, we're building technology to scale the circular economy. So there's by no means any way that we could be successful if we're not focusing on having those different stakeholders and different voices all throughout the value chain of our own work, whether that be internal to our company, whether that be in the users that we serve or the clients that we support. So it's dead important for us and kind of our goal, but the goal should be to transition with everybody at the table and not just some.
Thank you, Gary. Nice segue into the next question around humanizing the circular economy and humanizing the work. One of the things that I've noticed in our work when we work with companies who were on their journey is that there's a tendency to dehumanize it. We live up here. We're all intellectual. We're all in the theory and everything, but we don't really take into account what it actually means in practice and how individuals' lives and communities are affected, by the circular transition. So would love to hear your perspectives, both of you, on how do we localize? How do we humanize, the circular journey? How do we make this real to people in historically marginalized communities? And why should they care?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to start, Renee. So I think this is such a great, important question. I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I didn't know what circular economy meant until I had to do some Google searching. And I run a business about circular economy. I had to figure that out. I was just trying to share with people things that we weren't using. I didn't know that was called circular economy or industrial ecology. So I do think we have to find the right vernacular to speak to the people who are going to be impacted the most. But the way that I think we get at this at a practical level is seen in our everyday right now with COVID vaccine. As a scientist, I could spend a lot of time telling you about the theory behind how the current COVID vaccines work very differently than influenza vaccines, right? And I could spend all the headspace in doing that. But really, it's about the impact. Because once you see 200 million people vaccinated with this COVID vaccine, it just puts aside all of the theory I might have had in my head trying to translate to someone who might be a layman. I think we need to move out of the worlds of theory, move out of the worlds of planning, move out of and talking, quite frankly, and into implementing impact, because the impact itself will show and people will know what the circular economy is because they can actually see it showing up every day in their communities. So I think we should stop talking about it and just get to doing it. It's another way to make it real.
Great, thank you. Jessica?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting that Gary brought up the COVID vaccine and what's happening within my community. Native American communities have some of the highest vaccine rates across the nation. And I thought about that one day and I realized that the reason for that is, despite our horrible history with the United States in things like, spreading smallpox among indigenous nations, or even indigenous women being provided or being given, childcare. What's the word? I can't think of the word right now, but they were against their will and even against their knowledge, being given surgeries that would prevent pregnancies. So that's the kind of history that we have with the United States, yet we readily jumped into this COVID vaccine. Our communities are up to 70% vaccinated right now in some communities. And the reason for that is because we saw firsthand the impact of the virus within our communities, and that we also knew that in order to care for our communities, we all needed to take this risk. And it was a risk, but we took it because we wanted to look across the community. We didn't think about ourselves. We thought about all the people in our community and how this virus was impacting us as a whole. And so as a whole, we needed to do this. And so we all, everybody I know in my family is vaccinated, and there's no question about it. And so translating that into an economy, I think that, speaking of vernacular and the linear economy, those models that are out there, we've heard that in our communities. We've heard, this is going to provide jobs, and every resource in terms of the economy that's provided to our community is tied to jobs. And seeing now what we're experiencing is that it doesn't matter if we have jobs. Those jobs readily flow off of our reservation into towns outside of our communities. And so we don't benefit economically from jobs technically. And so in order to turn that around, we have to think about the economy from a people perspective. Is it providing food and water to our families who can then grow, where our children can grow in a healthy manner, where our children can access educational resources and not have to worry about whether or not they're going to have a home tomorrow because they're living in dilapidated housing, or have to worry about whether or not they're going to have food next week. You know, those are the things, those basic necessities are what our economy needs to start with. And that's where that circularity comes in. You have regenerative agriculture, you have people who are looking to provide solutions using technology in terms of creating care for elders or for children on the reservation, or even having access to internet that would then increase educational opportunities. And so for our communities, the economy and the circular economy is really about how do we provide those basic necessities and then circularly grow from there, if that makes sense.
It does. It makes a lot of sense. Thank you. The themes that I'm hearing from both you, Jessica and Gary, are around trust, rebuilding trust. It's about leading from a place of impact. So leading from the so what, leading from why does this matter to, you know, traditionally, historically marginalized communities, and leading from a place of this is how your life might be impacted, changed, improved, better. This is how you can survive through a circular economy. Now let's hear your thoughts toward it. So one of the questions that I have to ask, when you think about communication and when you think about, you know, the marketing of the circular economy and communicating out about why this is so important, especially to certain communities, I can't help but think about greenwashing. I can't help but think about the marketing of it, you know, from some corporations. So how, I guess two questions, how do communities cut through the BS, cut through the greenwashing, cut through what it looks like, to really understand the roots and the reality? But then also the communicators who are within corporations, what should they be keeping in mind to communicate authentically to the communities that they're trying to reach? I know there's a lot there. Either one of you could take that.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. You know, I think that, and I mean this in the softest way possible. I don't think it's on the communities. I think it's on me as a business leader in this space and my peers. I think it's on our elected officials, the mayors and the governors, and the people at the federal level. I think it's on the people who have the power, who have the resources, who have the technology to affect change, to bring the communities in and to make it understandable at the level of which they can. And so I kind of reverse it. I think that's one of the things that we have to be conscious of. And I think one easy, hacky way, to use a startup term, to get there is to have people from those communities on your boards, in your executive suites, making the products, implementing the solutions. So I think it's something that, from a branding and messaging perspective, I think is actually on the implementers than on the communities. The communities are just trying to survive in this post-COVID crazy world that we all find ourselves in. And so I think it's something that I think about all the time, and I encourage my peers to be doing so as well.
Thank you, Gary. Jessica?
Yeah, I'd have to agree that the responsibility lies within all of us, and especially when you talk about having elected leaders have those that have power be responsible for ensuring that that companies and industries are paying attention to what the impact of their operations and the impact of the products that they produce. And you know, we can very easily take something like renewable energy and have it negatively impact Indigenous communities through something, for example, mining of the materials needed for the renewable energy industry. And the average person is not going to understand that. They think, you know, yes, there's climate change. Yes, we need renewable energy. Yes, let's electrify all of our vehicles, not understanding that the process to do that means additional mining, which impacts Indigenous communities. And so it's the people in power, our elected leaders, that have the responsibility to say, I have Indigenous communities in my district, I have to be able to clearly communicate the impact of mining in the community. The electorate, the people who elect the leadership, needs to understand that, you know, these elected leaders are going to need some support in that. If we really care about including marginalized communities in looking at the impact of the direction we're trying to go with renewable energy or with the circular economy, we have to care enough to understand, to seek that knowledge, and also support those leaders that are standing up for marginalized communities.
And just another thought, Renee, just to add on to what Jessica was saying, I think it was so powerful, is like, I think another stakeholder that doesn't get talked a lot about is the educators. You know, whether that be the universities, whether that be the business schools, quite frankly, whether that be K through 12, the sustainability training and knowledge that you get is almost remedial, both in the business world, but also at the undergraduate and kind of secondary educational world. So we need to redo the books. We need to be teaching about circular economy and circularity within colleges and definitely within business schools, if not also earlier, so that there is a kind of structure that people in these communities can actually get, you know, great learning outside of kind of what we could do from a business or political leadership perspective.
I couldn't agree more. And thank you for adding that in. One of the questions that I was going to ask, you both kind of touched on it a little bit. I was going to ask, who specifically should be in the room? You always say people from the community should be in the room. Well, is that the friend that you always bring into the room, the one who's always part of the conversation? Is that the token voice that's always represented? Or is it the one that you pass by that you're not quite sure how to engage with, but you know they probably have something to share by way of experience, perspective, or idea towards solution? So I'd love to get very tactical and practical. Who should be in the room? So we said educators, we said supporting elected officials. Anyone else that you would encourage business leaders to actively, proactively seek out to invite into the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, on my end, you know, I think it's the whole community. So I think of it kind of in a wholesome fashion. So I think that means the providers, right? The healthcare workers, both doctors and nurses who are on the front line of some of the health disparities that you see in these communities that have landfills literally next door to homes. I think that's in some ways all the way to artists, you know, who can make really interesting, creative items and visuals and what have you with materials that flow from places that don't need to be. And then, of course, I think folks in the business world have to be at that table as well, because they have the power from an employment perspective to move dollars and resources in plants, physical locations, in areas that affect greatly communities like Jessica's and others. So I think literally every community leader, but I like to think of it from the doctor to the artist. I think everyone has really a stake in a global transition of the entire economy, and we have to be intentional about seeing those people at the table early.
Yes, the doctor to the artist. Sorry, Jessica, go ahead.
I would agree about the artists. I think artists in our community really hold the souls of our community dearly and are also able to communicate and communicate those values, you know, clearly and be very intentional about it. So I would definitely agree with Gary on that. I also want to shout out to water protectors. And they're not generally, you know, sometimes they can be seen as unruly or as, you know, troublemakers within the confines of a business setting that we normally think of as, you know, of meetings. But I think that they really hold that knowledge that we need, that's missing from the economy right now. And so I would definitely say to look at what some would, you know, term as protesters in our communities. A lot of Indigenous communities also have NGOs that are run by people who really have seen the impact, have that experience, and also the knowledge about how things can operate, how things can be better, and can really contribute to this conversation.
Yes, thank you both. We only have 4 minutes left. I don't know where the time has gone. Note to self, we need to request longer time next time for circularity. But I do want to hear any questions from attendees, anyone that has anything to ask Jessica or Gary, please do drop it in the chat. And while you're doing that, I do have one question for Jessica and then another for Gary after that. But Jessica, in particular to Indigenous communities, we know that there is a long history of keeping products in use, sharing materials. So the concept of circularity is not new to Indigenous communities. We don't automatically think of Indigenous communities when we think of circular economy. So what is it that we can learn from Indigenous communities? What are some of the principles or some of the practices or mindsets even that you think would be helpful for us as leaders to be thinking about as we really embark on our circular journey?
I think that from a very, very young age, we've always been taught about balance as being part of a value that's very important to our lives and to the life of our world and our Nehema, which is our Mother Earth. And we've been taught that everything has a living energy. Every living thing is living, and it has an energy that we need throughout our lives, and that we have to consider those with every step that we make. And so when we go about trying to be productive throughout our lives, we're taught to think about, the impact of everything around us, and how when we take a step, what is that step doing to the ground? What is that step doing to the air, to the energy that we're even moving into? And how do we need to relate to that? And so it's about creating relationships with everything that we see around us. And I think that that's just the basic knowledge that we hold, and that we've been taught from the time we were very, till I can't even remember when I was actually being taught that. But I know, looking back several times in my life where, I was really taught that, you don't just take these things for granted. This is part of something that's going to not only impact my life personally, but my community, but also the future generations.
Excellent, thank you. And you kind of touched on a question from Jim. Thank you, Jim, for asking that question too, around what can we learn from Indigenous communities. And Jessica, one of the things that resonated with me when you and I were speaking last week was this phrase or the sentiment of tread lightly and stepping lightly. And I really think about that, and I take it to heart, because everything does have a soul and everything is living, and we need all of each other and the resources to keep us going. So I was going to ask Gary you another question, but I would like to get to one that's in the chat, since we have about 30 seconds left. So the question is, would you suggest that all stakeholder groups, so healthcare, artists, businesses, discuss at once, or would you suggest there to be mini sessions, mini conversations within each other, and then bring it back to the larger group? Practically, how would you suggest folks to go about engaging different voices?
Yeah, I think people need to start where they are. It's incredibly hard to, I think large groups, big meetings are overvalued. Things typically don't happen in a large group. They typically happen at the local level. They typically happen when someone writes a blog, when someone writes a position paper, when someone makes a video that's heartfelt from the situation, and then people rally around. That's what I've been doing since I started Repley, when we were three people and no one cared about what we were doing around reuse and circular economy. And now that we have 40,000 people reading our monthly blog, I still do the same things that I did back then. So I think people should just start writing and talking and tweeting and petitioning where they are, and create that kind of ground up systems change.
Thank you for that, Gary. I think that's a great note for us to end on. Start where you are. The process does not have to be perfect. After all, what is perfection? I think the point is just to start and learn as you go. So we are unfortunately out of time. If you have any other thoughts or questions, we will stick around for a little bit longer for folks who might want to add something in the chat. We can answer. If not, feel free to reach out to Jessica, Gary, or myself. You have our information through the Hop-In platform. Feel free to connect with us. And we hope that this is just another step in the conversation, an ongoing conversation. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. I don't know if either of you can stick around for a little bit. If not, feel free to hop off.
I can stick around.
Okay, thank you. Jessica, I don't know if
I
you have to
go.
Okay.
But I'd be happy to answer questions offline.
Excellent. I'll send them your way. Thank you. Excellent. So just looking in the chat here, we have how can we get various companies and stakeholders on board with creating an inclusive transition?
Well, that's something we do at Replay. So whoever's asking that, info@Replay or Gary@Replay, would love to talk. .com.
Excellent. Thank you. And one other question, I'm going to sneak it in, even though it's just us, and I know we have a few folks here. So I know, Gary, you have been very vocal about the discrepancies in the triple R mantra. So reduce, reuse, recycle.
Yes.
So want to hear from you, how might a transformation in an economic model that currently embraces this wide scale notion of recycling as the answer to all of our problems, in that transition, as we look to really embrace the principles of circularity, so keeping materials in use for longer, designing out waste, regenerating natural systems, all that good stuff. How does that transition affect Black and Brown communities?
Love it. For me, it's two words: health and wealth. So it should probably go without saying that recycling being our end all and be all solution to what do we do with waste only furthers health issues in marginalized communities, whether that be from landfilling, whether that be from a whole host of kind of societal public health issues, power lines. I mean, there's just a whole lot in that kind of bucket. Water, Jessica talked about that. On the other hand, if we were able to think about how materials might be used and not be recycled, you start to ask both a question about health, but you start to tinge on how do we create more economic value. And when you go to the wealth portion of it, now we're talking about a couple categories. One, new entrepreneurship. People, as we talked about artists, people taking things that were already pre-owned and being able to do something maybe similar to what they were intended for, but maybe something completely different, turning a door into a picture frame that turns into something else. I mean, those are businesses that can be started by people in marginalized communities. But even if we're not starting new businesses with these materials, who has to ship these materials from point A to point B? Who has to repair these pieces of machinery or products if they're in disrepair? Those are jobs that could also be. So the way that I see it is being able to reuse things creates an entire different health and wealth infrastructure than recycling has been able to create. And I just did my first Clubhouse on Monday about this issue because we wrote a piece about it on LinkedIn. And one of the things I learned in preparing for that is, there is tens of states right now, that do not have recycling programs. There are many hundreds of cities that have gotten rid of their recycling program. Why? Because of 2018 and China refusing to take recycled cardboard and paper, that has caused in some communities a 4x cost to those locales on trying to stand up those recycling programs because recycling is expensive. And so now with no recycling, it's actually cheaper to send things to the landfill. So what do you think communities are doing with it? Landfill. And then we get back into the health part. So to me, we need a different investment structure. We need more technology. That's what we're hopefully trying to build at Replay, to power reuse at a city, state, and federal level. But I think that's where we need to go. Recycling always have to be there. It has to. It's the best of the last solutions from a material flow perspective. But it should be our first. And for goodness sakes, it's not delivered the kind of outcomes to get us more to circularity than I think we need and these communities deserve.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for that. Health and wealth. I am going to, this is being recorded, so I'm going to commit you to having a part 2 conversation with me on
Absolutely.
this.
That's all I talk about, reuse, baby.
I love it. There's so much more that we could say about that. I think we could go so much deeper into that, just that whole creating a different economic model around health and wealth, with that at the center.
Yes.
I wish we would have led with that, but that's okay. I don't want to take
Thanks for
folks
having
away.
me. It's awesome.
No, thank you. We still have some people with us, but I don't want to hold you from attending other sessions. We have about 30 people with us. So thank you for joining us. Feel free to, again, contact Gary or myself if you'd like to continue the conversation, and stay tuned for part 2, because you've heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. He's committing to speaking with me again.
I'm Gary, 2 R's, GARRY at repley.com. Hit me up. We'd love to talk about reuse or recycling.
Excellent. And I'm going to put mine in there. I'm rloper at pixaraglobal.org. And Gary, I'll drop yours in there too.
Yeah, please.
So, thank you, everyone,
so
for
much,
joining
Renee.
us. Thanks,
Right,
Gary.
bye.
There's the sirens. Bye. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm just going to drop my chat in here. And Gary Cooper is his name. I don't want to misspell his email address, so I'll just do it there, and you can search him in the speaker's agenda. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.